In loving memory of Isao Takahata, the greatest colleague and mentor of Hayao Miyazaki and co-founder of Studio Ghibli, the 40th anniversary of which this story commemorates, as well as that of its first ever feature film. I present to you all the very first complete draft of the Sorceress of Leaf and Sand, made 10 long years after the story was originally conceived in the spring of 2015. The prophecy of the West, once made 3,000 years earlier by Magellan the Wise during the Fourth Age of Sakaya, when the Triads of Triania were at the height of their power, foretells the global apocalypse that will end their dominion over the world in the coming Fifth Age, and the only one who can forestall the coming geopolitical catastrophe. And it reads as this. On the day the last Trian dies, the golden master orb shall fall upon the lonely tree, and 2 dragons of steel shall plunder the entire land for control over it and its awesome power to conquer and destroy. But only a black-haired sorceress dressed in red, who hails from the southwestern lands and is at the age of 15, can end the coming age of darkness and despair. Only she can use her mastery of water, earth, air, and fire to foil the plans of the dragons of steel. Only she can turn their delusional ways of greed, might, and ill will into compassion, kindness, and love for others. Only she can bring them to justice with the trust of the gods and spirits of nature, and only she alone can destroy the golden master orb with her magic, so that once she is raised from the ashes, the sorceress of leaf and sand shall witness for herself the sight of 100,000 white birds flying over the forest of hope. In the midst of the Arpon-Thuban War, the Thebanians invaded the kingdom of Basilia, which lies in the northwest of the island continent of Aetherosia, and have killed its king. Now his 17-year-old daughter, Princess Hilda, tries to stop the goblin soldiers from seizing some very important documents that pertain to the use of the golden orb, but her life is now at stake. And as the papers, Princess Hilda, our august emperor Tarrius just needs them for the war. In the name of my father, King Virtus, and of the Queen of Arpon, whom I both serve with unswerving loyalty, I won't. Please be nice to us and hand us the papers, or else we'll shoot your brains out. Never, you nasty goblins, for I shall give these documents to Her Majesty Queen Herida herself. Oh, so you refuse to accept our demands for the interests of Thebania, you little coward. Yes, I will. But the needs of Queen Herida far exceed those of yours, so come forth and take these documents if you can. Thus a tense battle ensued between Hilda and the Thebanian troops, who quickly overwhelmed her with their numbers and took her as a hostage aboard their cargo plane.
Get off of me, you nasty goblins, and if you ever remove the crown off of my head, you shall dishonor the house of Basel forever. Thanks for these papers, ma'am. Therefore, our noble emperor carries the just to keep. Now stay safe and enjoy the ride. However, the last remnants of the Basilian army, led by their only surviving captain, hastily fought off the Thebanians and rescued their princess in the nick of time. We've just vanquished those pesky goblins, your royal highness, said their captain, and keep these documents with you as we escort you into the airship for your safety. Thank you so much, my brave, loyal subjects. And so the Basilian soldiers flew their royal highness high over the burning ruins of their kingdom and straight towards the Western Isles in order to keep the documents safe in the clutches of the Thebanians. But along the way, the Basilians' airship, which was provided for them by the Empress of Arpon, was met with a furious barrage of searchlights and gunfire spewing out from the ground below, and the fate of the kingdom of Basilia was sealed. Keiko-chan, do you think these apples are good enough for us to eat? And we need at least 40 of them for the big party tomorrow. Yes, Oka-san, and we haven't found at least one apple which shows signs of a worm eating it. Keiko and her mother loaded the apples into their wooden wagon, which was pulled by two chestnut horses, drove the wagon to their house, and unloaded the apples. Afterwards, Keiko wrote a few letters to her close friends so that they will be able to come and attend tomorrow's big celebration. Dear Setsuko, you and your family have all been invited to come over to my house for my 15th birthday party at 8:30. Please be sure to bring me some very special gifts and sweets for the occasion. Yours truly, Keiko Yamamoto. Now please send these two invitations to my friends Yoko and Yukiko, Hyukin and Moonen. Keiko promptly handed the letters over to her three pet crows. And please send this third invitation over to my friend Yataragasu. For over 50 long years, a war over the possession of a golden master orb, and thus the dominion of the entire world, has ravaged the island continent of Aetherosia. But in the southwestern lands, which have not been affected by the war that is raging abroad, the young mage Keiko Yamamoto has lived a pastoral life with her family. But on the day she turned 15 and her magical education came to an end, she was given a few special gifts for her birthday. A new crimson dress that came with a wide-brimmed hat and a pair of black boots, a magic staff for her to channel forth her power, and a scrying stone for her to look into the past and the future and to see people, places, and events from afar. But at lunchtime, when everyone was eating slices of a giant apple pie among other apple-related recipes that had been baked by the birthday girl and her family, a bunch of old folks brought the soon-to-be disastrous impacts of the war on the southwestern land's peaceful agrarian society into the conversation. Terrible news, folks, terrible news, said one old woman. For 50 years now, the war in the East has been getting increasingly worse day by day. And now it has been creeping ever closer to our peaceful borders, even though we have got nothing to do with it. I believe the situation in the East has become particularly terrible over the years, as far as been known from the news on the radio, said one of the old women. Cities and towns burning, scores upon scores of helpless refugees pouring in long lines across the countryside, bringing with them their cars and trucks, livestock and belongings. And all this time I've been waken up by the roaring din of engines overhead, and then I go outside to behold the most terrific sight of huge formations of warplanes from either side tearing across the sky, cried one old man. Big ones and little ones, and even fleets of dirigibles armed to the teeth with countless guns, too. Probably on their way to flatten more cities and people with their bombs, started another old man. And the pounding din of the distant cannons and guns is like an endless, rumbling thunder which never stops night or day. Too long have we been camping out on the far-off hills to the north and the southeast with our children to watch in awe the very spectacle of big armies and formations of soldiers and tanks clashing with each other from over a mile or two away, started one old woman. And this war has been going on for as long as we've been on this earth, said another old man, for 5 whole decades. Can you not imagine that? A long, long war which never ends. And I wonder whether or not we'll surely live to see the end of it. But I'm pretty sure the people in the far-off eastern lands have now accepted this time of constant death and suffering to be a normal part of their everyday lives and are living in far worse conditions than we are right now, said another old man. Rations, air raid precautions, and the threat of air raids. Strict orders from the higher-ups. That's what I'm talking about. On the evening right after her birthday party, Keiko donned her new outfit in front of her professor father, and she was curious to know about the ancient text that he was constantly reading at his study. Hitoshi then told his daughter that the text had to do with some ancient spells that the Trians made regarding the creation and destruction of their most sacred possession, the Golden Master Orb. But that night, a flying fireball in the form of a huge, mysterious airship crash-landed onto a grassy field near the Yamamoto's house, and Keiko joined the other residents of the southwestern lands in rescuing the ship's victims. But of all the survivors who eventually succumbed to their wounds, it was Princess Hilda who gave the mage a few mysterious documents for her to throw into the flames, but not without heeding some very important advice. Please go into the Forest of Hope and find the golden orb that sits upon the lonely tree before the goblin empires of Arpon and Thuban do so. Yes, I will, said Keiko. The next morning, the residents of the southwestern lands heard the roaring of hundreds of aircraft engines, and they looked up to see an entire fleet of Imperial Thubanian Army airships, bombers, fighters, and transports tearing across the partly cloudy spring sky. At the head of the fleet was Emperor Terius the Just of the Thubanian Empire, who landed the Wild Blue Yonder, his personal juggernaut of a warplane in the middle of the lands, stepped out onto a wide, grassy hill with his entourage, and goaded the people of the southwestern lands into joining his ambitious enterprise, lest they face total annihilation. But upon hearing that the Golden Orb documents have all been burned at the hands of the Yamamoto's daughter, he had them captured, while Keiko was taken into the safety of the borderland woods by the little wood elf Robbie Hyde and his wise pet raccoon Vicky, and it was from them that Keiko learned about the ancient prophecy of the West, a prophecy that she was destined to fulfill right before the world's ending. When they took her into a hidden cave in the borderland woods and showed her a magnificent tapestry made several centuries ago by elven hands. And with that in mind, Keiko, Robbie, and Vicky the raccoon all ventured together into the vast, swampy forests of the Green Marshes, And it was there that the trio found out that the resident nature gods and spirits were no longer trustworthy of man due to his rising arrogance and indifference towards the natural world. But Keiko and her friends were nonetheless able to give a sick and Kylosaur forest spirit a few magic herbs in order to cure it of the contaminated and polluted food and water that it just consumed. All throughout her journey across the green marshes, Keiko used the power of her magic and spells to overwhelm and undo the plans of the Arpanian and Thubanian empires to drain the wetlands and industrialize the land with much pollution involved. And with new magical forests growing over the ruins of factories and fortresses, the mage took her friends on a calm canoe ride across the swampy woods where the tall, majestic cypress trees grew. But once the trio reached a long, narrow river that flowed through a tall ravine, Keiko summoned a lone vine that was hanging above the river to swing her and her friends to the other side as giant, hungry alligator gods lunged and snapped at their heels. And as the sun sank under the woods, the trio stumbled upon a giant, ancient oak tree, spent the coming night sleeping upon its branches, and were soon startled from their slumber to find a small herd of tall-crested forest gods browsing upon the leaves under the light of the full moon. On the following day, the trio entered the market town of Bedford, and Keiko used her magic to pacify a swarm of attacking flying little tree spirits that were terrorizing the town's residents. As the three travelers reached the northern lands of the green marshes, they all came across a stream and were quite surprised to find two flamingo-headed dinosaur river spirits fighting over a lump of fish-shaped trash that was probably thrown into the river by careless men or goblins. And Keiko turned it into an actual fish that was as long as a man's arm with a quick snap of her fingers. And once the trio soon went to fetch some water at the edge of a small waterfall, they were all caught unawares by a small company of knights led by Bezil the Bold, who were patrolling the southernmost frontier lands of the county of Comtea. And despite a tense encounter in which Keiko tried to use her magic to scare off the knights' horses, and the knights in turn tried to pin her down and prosecute her for being a witch, she and Bezil laid aside their differences and soon came to terms with one another in their shared goals of stopping the long war between the Arpanian and Thubanian empires that has ravaged their shared homeland of the island continent of Aetherosia, and their commitment to a better, more peaceful world worth fighting for. And so it was that Keiko continued to lead Robbie and Vicky the Raccoon across the northern frontier of the Green Marshes with an even loftier goal in mind that she shared with Bezil the Bold. And along the way, the travelers were able to purchase 3 individual tickets to board the fabled magical Black Valley Express at the insistence of Vicky, and knew that doing so was the easiest way for them to reach the lands where the county of Comtea and the Black Mountains meet. And after having risked their lives wandering across the infamous and treacherous Swamp of Sorrows, which was once the site of a great battle 25 years earlier during the still ongoing war, the trio soon ascended the top of a wooden 750-foot tall watchtower of Udul Hadun, which was once built in ancient times by the kings of the West to watch over their lands and soon used for the same purpose by the Count of Comtea, and they were all treated to a magnificent view of the many vast lands that lay beyond the green marshes. The trio also spotted not only the Black Mountains looming in the distance, but also their namesake train heading towards where the southernmost station is. After Keiko promptly assumed her bird form to fly her friends over to the station and to board the train with them for Comtea and its neighboring mountains, she came across dozens of terrified children, many of whom were orphans who had lost their parents to the war, huddled in threes in some cars at the back, with a few women or seniors to protect them. And it was from the personal accounts and stories of those shell-shocked refugees that Keiko learned about the devastating toll that the Thobanian bombers had brought to the cities and towns of Arpanian allied countries further south, and vice versa. The mage also dined with her friends in a car that was called the Marvelous Mockingbird, and which looked more like a pub than the usual dining car. And upon stepping out of the train at their destination, the travelers were greeted with a shower of propaganda leaflets that came from the bomb bay of a passing Thobanian warplane. But it was in the Arpanian allied human kingdom of Paisana that Keiko and her friends witnessed nearly 100 battle-hardened but overwhelmed soldiers of an artillery regiment struggling to fight off the giant mechanical war elephants of the Imperial Thobanian army, and she also lovingly brought forth magical bowlfuls of fruits, meats, veggies, and her own special herbal medicine to feed and tend to the needs of the injured and wounded Paisanan soldiers, who filled the atmosphere of the hastily built field hospitals with their blood and screams of agony, at the request of their wary commanders and officers, as their daily rations dwindled. After doing those arduous tasks and using her magic to help the county of Comtea and Bezil the Bold end the Arpan-Thuban War, Keiko led her friends further up into the valleys of the majestic Black Mountains, which was once home to an ancient dwarven stronghold. There they hiked across great expanses of steep, rolling hills that were dotted here and there with many scattered groves of firs and pines, and the verdant meadows were in full bloom with fields of wildflowers that came in different shades of blue, yellow, white, red, pink, and purple. But along the way, the three travelers will also soon stumble upon a giant Quetzalcoatl sky god named Arashi, who happens to be the guardian spirit of the entire land. Yet Keiko's hike across the Black Mountains, however, did not go unnoticed, for the rulers of the Arpanian and Thobanian empires both perceived the Sorceress of Leaf and Sand and her magic spells to be a major threat to their own plans for the colonial conquest of Aetherosia, the exploitation of the island continent's raw materials, natural resources, and minerals, and the enslavement and subjugation of its various indigenous peoples. But the bold and steadfast Keiko kept on holding back the attacks and threats of her goblin assailants, one by one. One day, she stopped a battalion of Arpanian tanks and a Thobanian fighter plane from harassing panic-stricken indigenous civilians. And another day, she flew off in her bird form to fend off an assault from the Wild Blue Yonder and its fighter escorts, by daringly facing them head-on in a dogfight. But Arashi, the Quetzalcoatl sky god, was quick to reassure Keiko and her friends that he and his fellow nature spirits were on her side and will soon protect her from the assault of the goblins. And soon he flew the three travelers in a straight path over the hills and mountains, and across the partly cloudy skies toward the floating island kingdom of Luftia, the last surviving realm of the legendary skyfarers of old, is. The queen of that country was eager to seek Keiko's magical aid in the defense of her rich kingdom from the attacks of the Imperial, Arpanian, and Thobanian air fleets, and she rewarded the teenage mage for her services with some special gifts and made her a heroine of Luftia. Afterwards, following a tense encounter with some goblin airships, Arashi proceeded to fly Keiko and her friends east and back towards the meadows of the Back Mountains. And as the sun was sinking, the legendary and noble sky god landed the trio close to the foot of a great grassy hill upon which stood a quaint little cottage that was home to the 12-year-old Greta and her kind grandmother and mother. This little family of three, whose lumberjack father and three older sons have been fighting in the war for a long while and have never returned, all lovingly provided the tired Keiko and her friends with a few refreshing evening meals and tea, as well as a decent place for them to sleep. On the following day, the family provided a morning breakfast for the travelers, and Keiko thanked the women for their hospitality before she and her friends left their cottage for the ancient and dangerous Forest of Despair, which lay right below the hill to the east of the Black Mountains and was teeming with giant, dark-scaled fell serpents that slithered in spirals from around the tops of the pine trees and could kill a man with their lethal venom. But Keiko was able to fend off the serpents with her magic spells, until at last she had finally broken a curse which had kept the resident Therizinosaur forest spirit dormant for centuries. Keiko, Robbie, and Vicky all paid their respects to the great forest spirit, left the Forest of Despair, and soon reached the westernmost outskirts of the vast and expansive Silver Plains. And it was there that they stumbled upon a small flock of strange, kangaroo-like dinosaurs that were known as steppe swans. Keiko bonded with and mounted one and nicknamed it Kyofu, which means strong wind in the tongue of her ancestors. And when a fleet of Thobanian warplanes, led by Terius the Just, and his wild blue yonder, swooped in to hunt down the steppe swans for sport, Keiko proceeded to lead the flock away from their sudden onslaught, tried to repel the planes with a few defensive spells, and then used her magic to trick and distract the warplanes into hunting a different, fake target, while she and the steppe swans managed to escape in another direction. Afterwards, Kyofu continued to take Keiko and her friends on a bounding ride across the Silver Plains to where the Sands of Fate are, all while the free peoples of Aetherosia, who were busy fighting off the Arpanians and Thobanians, were about to face their darkest hour. Upon reaching the prodigious, winding dunes of the Sands of Fate, Kyofu continued to guide the travelers around there for the first half of the journey, and he soon left them to walk across the dunes on their own for the second half. Although they sweltered at times under the scorching heat of the midday sun, Keiko was able to carry on thanks to the wide brim of her hat, and she and her friends were able to conjure or find enough sources of water to quench their thirst. And along the way, the travelers encountered large serpentine lizards which jumped through the sand like dolphins in the ocean, a tribe of scimitar-wielding sand elves who were well versed in the riddles, lore, and magic of the desert, and many nomadic tribes of horse-riding men who fought each other over its few remaining water holes. Keiko also managed to use the power of her magic to disrupt the oil-related activities of the goblins and the men who worked for them. Sometimes, with the use of sandstorms, she conjured herself, and she and her friends, upon seeking the advice of the local desert-dwelling tribes of elves and men, soon discovered a secret underground passageway to the Hills of Fire, which was situated in the middle of the desert and was guarded at the end by a fierce half-centipede, half-human demoness. After journeying through this cavernous tunnel complex and battling the giant spiders which climbed across its walls, the sorceress proceeded to defeat the demoness in a battle, and she kindly showed the trio the path to the fabled red and orange land of towering cliffs and cacti. And it was there that Keiko, Robbie, and Vicky all came face to face with Julius, a ferocious, fire-breathing Carcharodontosaur desert god who was the guardian spirit of the entire area and is feared by men and goblins alike for having an infamously bad temper. Yet despite his fearsome, dragon-like reputation, Julius was quick to use his aggressive temperament, fiery breath, imposing bro horns, and toothy jaws to guard the sorceress and her friends, when she calmly and kindly reassured the traumatized dinosaur god that she is not affiliated with any of his former goblin or human oppressors, who once almost nearly decimated his kind within the span of 50 years and imprisoned him in Colosseum-style battles to the death, and that she'll protect him with her compassion or magic if necessary. And after Julius helped Keiko out in many of her endeavors and led her and her friends across the Hills of Fire, through the narrow passes of the Red Mountains, and down to the edge of the Great Canyon, which separates the Forest of Hope from the arid desert lands of the West. All whilst encountering a tribe of pastoral mountain dwellers who have cleverly irritated the invading Arpanian and Thebanian armies with their hit-and-run guerrilla tactics, as well as the last surviving fire maiden Tara Karanteka and her fearsome pet salamanders. The teenage sorceress and her friends all paid their respects to the ferocious Carcharodontosaur desert spirit, and Arashi soon arrived to fly the trio across and high over the canyon and straight towards where the legendary Four Cliffs, which mark the southern borders of the Forest of Hope, are. But along the way, Keiko and her friends could see that the airships and warplanes of the Imperial, Arpanian, and Thebanian air fleets were heading in the same exact direction as they were, and the mage quickly warned the local human civilians to leave and seek higher ground in order to take shelter before the goblin armies arrived for the final battle. At the edge of the Forest of Hope, Keiko, Robbie Hyde, and Vicky the Raccoon soon discovered that Emperor Darius the Just had recently built the giant, spiraling factory fortress of Hades, which was pumping out great amounts of toxic, polluting smoke from its tall smokestacks, as small warplanes flew around its many turrets, and newly built tanks rolled out from its walls to assemble and marshal his giant, industrialized army for a massive assault upon the Arpanian positions that were within striking distance of the Great Lonely Tree, as well as upon much of the surrounding forest itself. Then the sorceress led her friends on a daring but well-planned infiltration of Hades, used her magic to disable much of the fort's assembly lines and other forms of industrial infrastructure, and fought off the many goblin guards who stood in her way, until at last she reached and opened the doors of the Thebanian Emperor's military headquarters and throne room, and politely convinced him to peacefully give up his warmongering ways, call off his upcoming attack on the Forest of Hope, and allow her to deal with the Arpanians in a similarly diplomatic fashion. But although Darius the Just initially and haughtily scoffed at Keiko's words, then got livid at her for trying to question his authority and challenged the sorceress to a magical duel which ended with the collapse of his mighty fortress by the pounding of her magic staff, He soon reluctantly accepted Keiko's demands for a just peace, only for her to personally witness bombers from both sides raining destruction from above onto the Forest of Hope below, until it was gradually consumed by a vast red sea of fire. In the enormous ensuing battle which determined the fate of not only all of Aetherosia, but also that of the entire world of Sakaya, the huge armies and air fleets of the Arpanian and Thebanian empires, as well as those of their loyal human allies, clashed over the possession of the Golden Master Orb, and turned much of the Forest of Hope into a blazing inferno of burning trees and logs. Yet amidst this chaos, the Comtean army, nobly led by Beziel the Bold, tried to pacify the goblins, and so did Keiko in her attempts to prevent any further harm to the sacred old-growth forest and its inhabitants. But in her greatest time of need, the gods and spirits of nature arrived to help Keiko turn the tide against the goblin and human troops. And when she was knocked over by the trunk of a mechanical Thebanian war elephant, Julius courageously rushed in to save her life by fending off the beastly war machine with the use of his horns, jaws, and fiery breath. And once she recovered and thanked Julius for saving her life, Keiko finally proceeded to do the unthinkable deed of climbing up the lonely tree, placing the tip of her staff upon the golden orb, and reciting an ancient, mysterious, and powerful spell in the tongue of the Trians, which shook the whole world and destroyed the magical object of power and domination over others once and for all. The gigantic and fiery explosion, which scattered and blew away the airships, tanks, soldiers, planes, and other war machines of the Arpanian and Thebanian armies, as well as those of their human allies, also obliterated much of the Forest of Hope and its surrounding lands, until they became barren, desolate wastelands, riddled with ash and smoke and seemingly devoid of life, until large crowds of excited human civilian spectators could see with their own eyes a massive herd of dinosaurian and pterosaurian nature gods and spirits arriving and gathering in a big circle around the spot where Keiko's hatless and seemingly lifeless body lay. Then they all repeatedly exhaled in unison, so that they made magical swirls of golden dust which danced around her, and they all slowly began to lift all their heads up in unison. Then everyone gasped and watched in awe as Keiko's body, which was illuminated by a shining golden aura, steadily rose high up into the air until it stopped as a great flock of 100,000 white cranes tore across the clear blue sky as a field of seedlings, which emerged in the presence of the nature spirits, rose up to become large, mature trees, as the Forest of Hope, including the once destroyed lonely tree, quickly recovered and regrew into its former state. And once Keiko opened her eyes to the sight of the flock of white birds, thanked the gods and spirits for helping and supporting her in her greatest time of need, and stood up upon the golden aura to face the crowds with a smile. Everyone cheered with much elation, for the ancient prophecy of the West has at last been fulfilled. The sorceress soon rose down with a graceful twirl and regained her hat, and upon touching the ground, Beziel the Bold ran up to her with much delight, lifted her up by the waist, and spun her around like a father playing with his daughter, much to the joy of Robbie Hyde and Vicky the Raccoon, as well as to the whole cheering crowd of bystanders, including Keiko's newly bred parents and siblings. And as the Arpanians and Thebanians peacefully left the newly risen Forest of Hope, and eventually all of Aetherosia for good, The entire world recovered as forests and deserts spread here and there, as nature and nature spirits took over the landscape and healed it of its wounds, as the humans rebuilt their cities, towns, and villages, and finally learned to coexist with nature, and as Kenko began to start a new, peaceful life with Beziel, Robbie, and Vicky.